What would you do if a stranger's last wish gave you something you never knew you were missing? Weston Albright, 34, had exactly $11.42 in his checking account when the letter arrived. He knew the exact amount because he'd checked that morning while sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the Food King on Route 9, trying to decide whether he could afford both the propane canister and the loaf of bread, or just one. He chose the bread. The letter was sitting on top of the pile of overdue notices when he got back to the trailer. Electric, water, and one from the county assessor's office that he hadn't opened yet because he already knew what it said. The envelope was different from the others. Thick cream paper, the kind that felt almost waxy between your fingers. A law firm's return address printed in navy blue. Holt, Beckwith and Crane, attorneys at law, Ellsworth, Maine. Weston. He set the bread on the counter and stood there in his kitchen. If you could call it that, really just a row of cabinets and a 2-burner stove crammed into the end of a single-wide trailer, and turned the envelope over in his hands twice before opening it. The letter was 3 pages long. He read the first paragraph 4 times. It informed him that a woman named Cecelia Drummond had passed away on the 14th of March at the age of 81. It informed him that Miss Drummond had no living relatives. It informed him that per the terms of her last will and testament, filed with Hancock County Probate Court, the entirety of her estate, including the property known as Drummond Point Lighthouse, situated on 12 acres of coastal land in Penobscot Bay, Maine, had been left to one Weston Albright of Carmody, West Virginia. He read it a 5th time. Then he sat down on the floor, not on a chair. The floor. He didn't know anyone named Cecelia Drummond. He had never been to Maine. He had never, to his knowledge, had any connection to a lighthouse. He was a 34-year-old man who had spent the last 2 years working part-time at a hardware store and watching his late father's small engine repair business collapse under a pile of debt he hadn't even known existed until the bank called 6 weeks after the funeral. The letter said he needed to contact the firm to confirm his identity and his intention to accept or decline the inheritance. There was a number at the bottom. There was also a handwritten note on this last page, on a separate sheet of paper befolded inside, written in some small, tight cursive that looked like it had been pressed hard into the page. Mr. Albright, you don't know me, and I'm sorry for the shock this must be. There are things about Drummond Point that I couldn't explain in a letter and wouldn't want to, but I chose you for a reason. I hope, in time, you'll understand it. The lighthouse has been waiting for someone who needs it. I believe that person is you. Please don't sign anything away without seeing it first. C.D. Weston read that note 6 times. He drove up in 3 days, which was about as fast as the transmission on his '09 Silverado would allow him to push it. He'd called the firm and spoken with a woman named Brenda, who had a Maine accent thick enough to cut with a knife, and who told him the estate included the lighthouse structure, the keeper's cottage, 12 acres of rocky shoreline, and what she called various personal effects and contents. She also told him there were some outstanding matters regarding the property he'd need to review in person. He asked her what kind of outstanding matters. There was a pause. There's a gentleman who has been, residing on the property, she said. We've been unable to reach him to inform him of the situation. Residing, Weston repeated. He's been there a very long time, Brenda said. Mrs. Drummond permitted it. His name is Edmund Haas. He's quite elderly. The drive up was 14 hours. Weston made it in one shot with 2 gas station coffees and a bag of pork rinds, and he crossed into Maine just as the sky ahead of him was turning the particular shade of grey that happened right before dawn when you couldn't tell clouds from sky from water. By the time he reached the gravel road that the GPS directed him down off Route 15, there was just enough light to see what he was driving toward. He stopped the truck. He got out. The lighthouse stood at the end of a long point of land that jutted into the bay, surrounded on 3 sides by water. The tower was white stone, maybe 60 feet tall, and even from this distance he could see that the paint was peeling in long strips and that the lamp room at the top was dark. The keeper's cottage crouched beside it, grey clapboard siding, a red chimney that leaned slightly to the left, 2 windows on the front face that caught the early light like eyes. Behind the cottage, the 12 acres of scrubby pine and rock tumbled down to the water on both sides. It was the most beautiful and most broken thing Weston had ever seen. He stood there in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and tried to understand how this was real. A woman he'd never met had looked at a list of every person in the world. This specific, irreplaceable, falling-apart piece of the coast of Maine should go to him. The door of the cottage opened. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was old, very old. He moved the way people move when every joint in their body has been lodged a formal complaint. But he made it to the porch railing, and he stood there looking at Weston, with an expression that wasn't hostile exactly, but wasn't warm either. He had white hair that the wind off the water immediately rearranged. He wore canvas trousers and a wool sweater that might have been green once, and he held a ceramic mug in both hands like it was the source of all available heat in the world. "You'd be the Albright boy," he said. His voice carried across the yard without difficulty. "I'm Weston," Weston said. "Edmund Haas," the man said. He didn't extend his hand, he just looked at Weston for a long moment. "I suppose you'd better come in then. Though I'll tell you now, I don't know what she told you about this place, and I don't know what she didn't tell you. And those 2 things are going to matter a great deal." Weston followed him inside. The cottage was cluttered in the specific places that have been lived in for a very long time by a person who kept everything. Books were stacked on every flat surface. There were navigational charts pinned to one wall, decades old from the look of them. A wood stove in the corner was putting out a respectable amount of heat. On the kitchen table, which was mostly buried under papers, and a very large and very old cat, 2 mugs were already set out. Edmund Haas, it turned out, had known he was coming. "Brenda Holt called me," he said, without embarrassment, settling into the chair at the head of the table like he'd been sitting in it for 40 years, which, Weston would later learn he had. "Said you'd be driving up from West Virginia. I figured today or tomorrow." "You could have left," Weston said. Edmund looked at him. "Could I?" It wasn't a question. It wasn't really an argument either. It was just a statement of something that Edmund clearly considered obviously untrue, and Weston didn't push it. Edmund was 83 years old. He had been living in this cottage as a guest of Cecelia Drummond for 31 years. He had come here, he said, because he had nowhere else to go, and then he stopped talking and looked at his coffee and didn't add anything to that. "What was she like?" Weston asked. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up off the water, and Weston could hear it finding the gaps in the cottage walls. "She was the stubbornest person I ever knew," Edmund said finally, "and I've known a few." He paused. "She was also the most honest. Those 2 things went together in her case. The honesty made her stubborn, or the stubbornness made her honest. I could never quite tell which. She never told me why she left it to me," Weston said. "Her note said there were things she couldn't put in a letter." Edmund looked at him then, and something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, more like a door that had been shut for a very long time was being slowly pushed against from the other side. "No," he said. "I don't suppose she would." He stood up then, bones and all, and went to the far corner of the kitchen, where a wooden cabinet stood between the wall and the refrigerator. He reached into the back of the top shelf. Weston could hear him feeling around, and brought out a small metal box, the kind hardware stores sell for keeping important papers. It was locked. Edmund set it on the table in front of Weston. "She left me specific instructions," Edmund said. "Give you this on the 2nd day. Not the 1st. She said you'd need a night here before it meant anything to you." Weston looked at the box. "And the key?" Edmund sat back down. "She said you'd find it. He slept in the Lighthouse that first night, on a cot he found in the supply room at the base of the tower. There was no electricity running to the lighthouse itself. The cottage had a generator, and he lay in the dark, listening to the water move against the rocks 60 feet below the single window. He didn't sleep for a long time. He thought about his father. He thought about the shop. 12 years of his father's life in that shop. The smell of oil and metal and gasoline. The particular way the overhead light had buzzed in winter. He thought about standing in the parking lot of the bank while a man in a tie explained to him about the second mortgage and the business loan and the credit line, and how the numbers altogether came to a figure that was substantially more than the shop and the equipment and everything else were worth. He thought about the trailer he was currently 3 months behind on. He thought, "What am I doing here?" Then he thought, "Where else would I be?" In the morning, he climbed to the lamp room at the top of the tower. The stairs were iron, old, with a particular resonance when you stepped on them, like the whole structure was a tuning fork. The lamp room itself was maybe 8 feet across. The original Fresnel lens still sitting in the center, enormous and faceted and remarkable, though the mechanism that turned it had long since seized. The view from up there, he stood at the glass and looked out over Penobscot Bay, and understood for the first time in his life what people meant when they said a place could stop your heart. The water was moving in 100 directions at once, all of it catching the early sun, and the islands sitting in the bay were green and dark and real. He found the key at the base of the lamp housing. It was taped there with a strip of electrical tape that had gone hard with age, a small brass key with a number stamped into it. He had to work it loose carefully. When he held it up to the light, he saw someone had used a pin or a nail to scratch 3 letters into the brass. W.A., his initials. He stood very still for a long moment, with the wind moving around the lamp room and the water moving 60 feet below. She had known who he was. She had left a key with his initials on it, waiting in the lamp room. For how long? He went back down. The box opened on the first try. Inside were 3 things: a photograph, a letter sealed in a smaller envelope, and a folded document that turned out to be a single page of handwritten notes, more list than letter, with dates going back 40 years. He looked at the photograph first. It was old. He guessed late 1970s, from the color and quality. 2 young men standing outside this cottage, grinning at the camera, one of them with his arm thrown around the other's shoulders. One of the men he recognized immediately, even at 25 years old, from the jaw and the eyes. It was his father. The other man, Weston assumed, was a much younger Edmund Haas. He sat down on the kitchen floor. Edmund, who had been standing in the doorway, came and stood over him and looked at the photo for a moment. "Your father," he said. Not a question. "Yeah." Weston's voice came out smaller than he intended. "He was a good man," Edmund said. "We knew him a long time ago. He and Cecelia. They were close for a time. Before he moved away, before he met your mother." "He never knew." Edmund stopped. Weston looked up at him. Edmund sat down slowly, across from him on the edge of a footstool. He held his mug in both hands again. "There are things," Edmund said, "that people keep because they think they're protecting someone, and then they keep them so long they forget whether the protection was ever the point, or whether it just became habit, whether the secret became the thing itself." "Edmund," Weston said. "What didn't she tell him?" Edmund looked at the window. The cat had come in at some point and was sitting on the windowsill, looking out at the water. "When your father left," Edmund said, "Cecelia was pregnant." The wind found the cottage again. "She didn't tell him," Edmund said. "She was certain, and I disagreed. I want you to know that. I told her at the time, and I'll say it now. She was certain that telling him would ruin his life. He'd just gotten the job in West Virginia. He'd been trying to get out of here for 2 years. She loved him enough to let him go." Weston looked at the photograph in his hands. "The baby," Edmund said, and his voice had changed, going quieter, "was a girl. She was born in January of 1985. Cecelia raised her here at this lighthouse for 14 years. The list, the folded document. Weston unfolded it now and looked at the dates. Born January 1985. School enrollment, Ellsworth 1990. Hospital, 1992. And then a line of dates that stopped in 1999, and after that just 2 words in different ink, written later. Car accident. Her name was June, Edmund said. It was December. The road out by Route 15, ice. He stopped. Swallowed. Cecelia never drove again after that. She never. He stopped again. Weston couldn't speak. Cecelia spent the next 20 years doing what she could, Edmund said. For your father, she tracked him. She never reached out. That was her one rule. She never reached out to him. But she knew when he married, knew when you were born. She said you were the piece of it that survived. Her words. She was peculiar that way, with words. She left me a lighthouse, Weston said, and his voice broke on the last word. She left you what she had, Edmund said simply. She didn't have anything else. She left you what she had, and she left me here to make sure you understood what it meant before you decided what to do with it. He went outside after that. He needed the cold and the wind and the specific bluntness of the rocks at the water's edge to be somewhere in his body, anchoring him. He walked the 12 acres for almost 2 hours. All of it. The scrubby pine that grew sideways from the constant wind, the ledge that dropped to the water on the east side, the remains of a small dock that had mostly gone back to the sea, the tall grass on the western field that was probably beautiful in July. He walked it all and tried to understand what he was inheriting. Not just the land, not just the lighthouse. When he came back to the cottage, there was a truck parked in the gravel beside his. White, new, out-of-state plates. New Hampshire. A man was standing on the porch talking to Edmund. Late 50s, grey hair, well-dressed in the way that people are well-dressed when they're trying to convey that they're important without quite seeming to try. He turned when Weston came up the path and extended his hand before Weston had reached the steps. Weston Albright, the man said, like he was confirming a stock price. I represent a development group out of Portsmouth. We've been trying to reach the estate for some time. Weston shook his hand. I just got here yesterday. I know, Gareth said. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided how a conversation is going to end. Which is why I wanted to speak with you before you made any decisions. I want to be straightforward with you. That's the only way I know how to do business. We've had our eye on this property for several years. The coastal acreage, the lighthouse structure, the development potential. We'd be prepared to offer you $850,000 for the property as is, contingent on a 10-day close. Weston looked at him. $850,000. He thought about $11.42. He thought about the propane canister and the bread. He thought about 3 months behind on the trailer. He thought about the bank's parking lot and the man in the tie. What would you do with it? Weston asked. We'd develop the point, remove the existing structures, they're beyond renovation costs, and build a boutique inn. 6 to 8 units. It's a remarkable site. Remove the lighthouse. Weston said. Gareth spread his hands. The cost of full restoration would. The Fresnel lens, Weston said. In the lamp room. You know what it's worth. Gareth paused. I'm not sure I climbed up this morning, Weston said. It's a third-order Fresnel lens, intact, original mounting. I work at a hardware store, but I can use the internet. You know what lighthouses like this sell for to private buyers. The right private buyer. You know what the land trust in Ellsworth would pay to put this in a conservation easement and keep the light. He wasn't sure where any of this was coming from. He hadn't planned any of it. But he found, standing on the porch of the cottage of a woman who had loved his father and lost a daughter and kept a lighthouse lit in her own way for 40 years, that he was not going to sign anything without understanding exactly what he was signing. Gareth's smile had become something more complicated. I'd like to make a counteroffer, Weston said. You leave. I look into my options for 30 days. If I decide to sell, I'll call you. The offer may not be available in 30 days, Gareth said. Then it won't be available, Weston said. There was a silence. The wind off the water moved through it. Gareth Townsend left. Edmund, who had said nothing through any of this, went inside and came back with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Weston without comment. They stood on the porch and looked at the water together. She'd have liked that, Edmund said finally. She never met me, Weston said. But she knew you. He looked out at the light on the water. She said, and I'll tell you this, and then I'm done telling you things. She said the problem with people like her and me was that we spent our whole lives protecting the wrong things, the secret instead of the person, the house instead of the life in it. He paused. She said she hoped you were the kind of person who understood the difference. Weston held the coffee mug in both hands, the way Edmund always held his. The lighthouse stood over them, white and chipped and still. He called Holt, Beckwith, and Crane the next morning. Then he called the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. Then he spent 4 hours on his laptop at the cottage kitchen table, while the cat sat on his foot, pulling up everything he could find about lighthouse restoration grants, conservation easements, heritage property funds. There were more options than he'd expected. He called his buddy Derek back in Carmody, who had done some carpentry work with him years ago, and who picked up on the second ring and listened to the whole story without interrupting, which was very Derek, and said, "Brother, are you asking me to come to Maine?" "I'm asking if you know anyone who does historic masonry," Weston said. "I know a guy," Derek said. "I can probably come too." He called the county assessor back in Carmody and made an arrangement about the trailer that he wasn't entirely happy with, but that he could live with. He sold his father's table saw, which had been sitting in the shop gathering dust, to a man in Beckley for enough money to cover the most urgent of the overdue notices. He called Gareth Townsend's number and left a message. "Not for sale. Not now. Thank you for your offer." He drove down to the town of Stonington and found the library and introduced himself to the librarian and told her he'd recently inherited a property in the area. The librarian named Beverly, who wore her reading glasses on a chain and seemed to know absolutely everything about Penobscot Bay, looked at him over those glasses and said, "You'd be the one who got Cecelia's Lighthouse then?" "Did you know her?" Weston asked. Beverly considered. "Everyone knew Cecelia," she said. She wasn't easy to know, but she was worth it." She paused. "She was also the best chess player in 3 counties, which I can tell you from personal experience." He stayed in Stonington for 2 hours asking Beverly questions. She didn't ask why he was asking, she just answered. Edmund was sitting in his usual chair when Weston got back, the cat arranged across his lap like a draft excluder. Weston sat down across from him. "I'm going to try to restore it," he said. "The lighthouse. There are grants. It's going to take time, and I don't know exactly how any of it works yet. But I think there's a way to do it that doesn't involve tearing it down." He paused. "I'd like you to stay, if you want to. I could use someone who knows the property." Edmund looked at him for a long moment. The wind off the water moved against the windows. "I've been here 31 years, Edmund said. "I know," Weston said. "I didn't have anywhere to go when I came," Edmund said. "She took me, and I know that too," Weston said. Edmund nodded very slightly, the way people nod when they're not quite ready to say yes out loud but have already decided. "There's a problem with the northeast foundation wall," Edmund said. "Been getting worse for the last 3 winters. You'll want to look at that first, before you do anything else." Weston got out a notebook. "Show me tomorrow, dawn," Edmund said. "Best light." That night, Weston sat in the lamp room of the lighthouse with a flashlight and his notebook and the photograph of his father and the young Edmund Haas grinning outside this cottage in the late 1970s. He thought about his father, who had spent 12 years building a small business and never once mentioned a place called Drummond Point, or a woman named Cecelia Drummond, or a daughter named June, who had been born in January and died in December. Maybe he hadn't known. Probably he hadn't known. The not knowing seemed, in the specific way of these things, worse and also somehow kinder. He thought about what Edmund had said, protecting the wrong things. He thought about what it would mean to protect the right thing. For once, to take a place that had held 40 years of a woman's grief and love and stubbornness and honest-to-God refusal to let it fall into the sea, and to stay. Below him the water moved in the dark. It made the same sound it had been making for centuries, patient and indifferent and enormous. Weston sat in the lamp room of the lighthouse that no one had lit for 20 years and wrote a list in his notebook of everything that needed to be done. The list was long. The list was, honestly, a little terrifying. He didn't tear it out. He didn't close the notebook. He added 3 more items. Before you go, I want to ask you something. You found out a woman you never knew had spent 40 years watching over the son of the man she loved. She never reached out, never asked for anything, just left him everything she had, in the end, and trusted that he'd understand why. Would you have stayed? I think Weston made the right call, but that choice, to take the harder thing when the easy thing is right there, $850,000 and a 10-day close, that's not a small thing. That's the kind of choice that tells you who you actually are. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe to keep the drama. We put out stories like this every week. And if you know someone who needs to hear something like this right now, share it with them. Sometimes people just need to know that the right choice and the hard choice can be the same thing. We'll see you next time.